Okay, good afternoon. Thanks everyone for being here today for this webinar presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman in partnership with the Behaviorally Informed Organizations Partnership. Although we're meeting virtually, we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We also stand in solidarity with the ongoing protests against systematic racism and discrimination. My name is Liz Kang, and I am a Knowledge Translation Manager and Research Officer at BIOrg and the moderator for today's webinar. We're delighted today to have Gautam Rao, Associate Professor of Economics at Harvard University. Before I introduce Gautam, I just want to go over the ground rules for this webinar. So following this introduction, our speaker will deliver a 35 minute to 40-minute presentation. And during the presentation, please submit your questions for our speaker by clicking the Q&A tab at the top of or bottom of your Zoom screen and typing into the entry box. And at the end of the talk, we will have a question and answer session in which I will select questions from the Q&A tab to ask our speaker. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Gautam. Gautam's research brings insights from psychology to bear on topics in economics, particularly topics relevant to developing countries. Recent projects include studying how improving sleep affects the economic outcomes of workers in India, how the endowment effect influences consumer demand for collateralized loans in Kenya, how research findings affect the beliefs and policy of mayors in Brazil, and how mixing rich and poor students in schools in India affects social preferences and behaviors. Thank you, Gautam, for being here today, and take it away.
Thanks so much, Liz. It's very nice to be here, and I look forward to all your questions and the discussion at the end. One question for Liz, actually. So do we have results from the poll that we had up?
Yeah, I think Cindy just showed us the results just before I started. There we go.
Great. So 70% of you think you'd be better off if you slept more. And we have some, nice variation in the amount you sleep on a typical night, but lots of you are sleeping, 6 to 7 hours or even less than 6 hours per night. And so you would be classified by sleep medicine or sleep scientists as being sleep deprived. And these are typical nights, not just some nights. So, potentially you would be classified as chronically, severely sleep deprived. And so our paper that we're going to talk about today, our research project, is about people getting, in fact, even less sleep than you. And we're going to try to understand, how that affects their well-being, their productivity, their earnings, and so on. And so let me share my slides. And does that all show up okay? Perfect. All right, so let me get started. So let me first say this is joint work with not just the people whose names are on the slide right now, but a large team of research assistants, surveyors, survey supervisors, and so on that work in our lab that we have in Chennai in India, the Behavioral Development Lab. I encourage you to check out the lab to learn about kind of other work we do. All right. Well, sleep is the most time-consuming activity of our lives, or, well, for some of you, judging from that poll, maybe not quite, but at least in second place. And doctors recommend that we all sleep about 7 to 9 hours per night. And the exact amount seems to depend, on the individual, what your optimal level of sleep is for performance. But as we saw in the poll results from you guys, but it's also true more broadly, there's a concern about an epidemic of sleep deprivation in rich countries. That is, many people are not sleeping these 7 to 9 hours per night. And there's a wealth of evidence from correlational observational studies. So these are studies which do a survey and find out how much you sleep and then correlate that with your health outcomes, but also of actual randomized experiments, almost all of which are done in the lab and over a pretty short run, which show that not sleeping enough or sleep deprivation has severe negative impacts on outcomes like your cognitive function. So, these are things like simple and complex attention, your alertness, your working memory, but also on a range of other outcomes like your happiness and subjective well-being. So, your sort of psychological well-being. And there's a little bit of evidence on things like decision making as well. And recently in economics, we've started to study, not in the lab, more in the field, how might sleep deprivation be correlated with your productivity and your wages? So for example, this paper by Gibson and Schrader. But as I said, nearly all the evidence is from the lab. So what this means is people are brought into the lab, and then a treatment group is essentially typically kept up all night. So many of the papers on this, or most of the papers on this that are experimental, study the effect of total sleep deprivation. Or it might be that you're only allowed to sleep 4 hours in the night, or 2 hours, or 6 hours. Okay. And as you can imagine, one can only do that for a few days. Not too many participants are willing to come and live for months on end in the lab being part of a study like this. And so these studies are typically for one night or a few nights. But second, and this also motivates our research, nearly all the evidence on the effects of sleep and sleep deprivation comes from rich countries. Now, there's this wealth of research from sleep medicine, and based on this, experts think that, as economists, we would say people are under investing in sleep, sort of interpreting the language of sleep experts. So here's a famous book. Some of you might have read it. It was a New York Times bestseller. It's beautifully written by Matthew Walker, who's a famous sleep scientist at Berkeley. The book is titled Why We Sleep, and makes claims like if we slept enough, our healthcare burden would plummet. We would have better mental health, fewer suicides, business would be more productive, so on and so forth. Sleep is the very best health insurance policy you could ever wish for. Now, this is a very exciting claim, and we wanted to take this claim to the field. And we wanted to do it in a context very different from the one the author of that book would have in mind, which is, most research is done in places like the US. And on the left, you can see a sleep environment of a typical family in the US, or not typical, not too far from it. So this is the Howard family in Colorado. By the way, these pictures are from a brilliant website called Gapminder, where you can go and learn something about the living environments of people around the world and at different income levels. And as you can see, the Shaw family in Calcutta in India lives and sleeps in a very different environment than the Howard family in Colorado. Now, why might this matter? Well, if you look at the picture on the right, if you look at the picture from Calcutta, you might think that the sleep that people manage to eke out in those conditions could be much worse. It could be that they're able to sleep much less. That's not obviously true. The fact is we know next to nothing about sleep in developing country environments, but it might plausibly be much worse. And as an economist, that makes me think, well, gee, then the marginal benefits of sleep may be very high. That is, if you're starting from a really low level, there could be big improvements, big gains, big economic gains, health gains, behavioral gains from improving people's sleep. Okay. So with this motivation, what this paper does is first to objectively measure sleep in Chennai, India. I'll tell you more about that in a second. And to do this in a couple of different populations, the main experimental sample is 450 participants who were employed as a part of being in the study for a whole month doing data entry work. Okay, so within this population, we provide randomized interventions to increase sleep. So one kind of intervention we're going to study is trying to get you to sleep more at night. And what this is going to do is encourage you to sleep more, or in one case, even give you outright modest financial incentives to sleep more. And a second kind of intervention is going to offer you the opportunity of taking a nap in the afternoon at your workplace. So these are two different ways of increasing sleep. It turns out both of them were able to sort of get them to work and get people to sleep more. And then we're going to measure the impact of this increased sleep on a range of outcomes. Both your work outcomes, remember these folks are hired to do data entry work, and so we can measure very precisely their productivity, their labor supply, their earnings, but we can also do a bunch of additional more lab experimental tasks that come from behavioral economics or from, excuse me, cognitive psychology or sleep medicine. So we can measure actually aspects of cognitive function, and I'll give you some examples later in the talk. And we can measure things like preferences and decision making, things that economists often study in behavioral economics, like self-control or present bias or limited attention. And we can measure using standard survey methods your psychological well-being, and we can measure, in fact, your physical health. Okay, so the paper is going to try to do three things. First, measure sleep in Chennai and learn something about the lives of low-income people in Chennai, India, particularly about sleep patterns. Is then going to try to improve or increase people's sleep, and then see what effect that has on outcomes we might care about. So here's why we're able to do this in the first place. It's the development of technologies in recent decades that allow us to now start measuring sleep objectively in the field. Now, these devices are called actigraphs, and they're kind of like Fitbits or the Apple Watch and other such devices you may be familiar with. They are going to infer whether you're asleep or whether you're awake from whether you're perfectly still or moving around. Okay. Now, these work much more accurately than Fitbits and so on. These are built for clinical sleep research. And they're about 90% accurate relative to the measure you'd get in a sleep lab. So in the sleep lab, we do what's called polysomnography, which is you'd be wired up and we'd be measuring movement and heart rate and breathing and brain waves. And putting all of those things together, we classify you as being awake or asleep. And these do about 90 to 95% as well as those. Okay, but what they can output is essentially the amount of physical sleep you got. And they can also measure something called sleep efficiency. Sleep efficiency is how much sleep you actually physically got divided by the total amount of time you were in bed trying to sleep. So they can detect kind of when you're in bed, essentially. And the ratio of those two is your sleep efficiency. What these watches can't do is, something that polysomnographs can do is do things like measure what stage of sleep you're in. Are you in REM sleep or NREM sleep and so on. So that we can't see. Okay, but the big advantage of these devices is we can now learn about your sleep as you go about your daily lives. That is, in your natural home environment, where it's very difficult to bring in like a polysomnograph and wire you up. Plus, in that environment where you've got 12 to 24 leads on you, you're probably not going to be sleeping naturally anyway, right? Whereas just wearing a wristwatch is probably not going to affect your sleep as much. Okay, so this really, I think, opens up the possibility to study sleep in the field and take this research from the lab where it's been so far more into the real world. So here's our first finding, which is about how much do the urban poor in Chennai sleep. And this finding is really going to emphasize the importance of this objective sleep measurement. Because one thing we also do in addition to using actigraphs is that we ask people to self-report their sleep. And we do this very carefully, as carefully as can be done, not just ask you, when did you go to bed and when did you wake up, but ask you to recall every time you woke up during the night, how long you think you were awake, so on and so forth. Okay, so as best we can do, we try to get you to tell us how much you sleep each night. And what we find here is numbers that are a lot like the US, in fact. So very similar to self-reported time of sleep in the US, and I'm guessing actually quite similar to the poll that you guys filled out, which is on average, people report sleeping about 7 hours per night. And sleep scientists would be a bit worried because they would see a bunch of individuals whose average sleep, I should say, this is your average sleep over 8 days in the baseline period of the study. There's a bunch of people who on average are sleeping less than 7 hours per night. Okay, and so this is somewhat disturbing, but we say, well, these folks do look a lot like people in the US. But in fact, that picture really changes once you actually physically measure sleep. So with objective sleep measurement, things look much, much worse. Hardly anybody is in this gray zone where they're actually getting the 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. The average drops from 7.2 hours to about 5.6 hours of sleep per night. And now actually our setting in Chennai, India and samples in the US start to look very different. So people in Chennai, although they self-report the same amount of sleep, are physically getting much less sleep than people in the US. We then do a more representative study. Remember, these results I'm showing you are for these 450 data entry workers. You might say, well, maybe that's a weird population. Maybe you selected people who have sleep problems. And so we then go and get a more random sample or closer to random sample across Chennai and basically find exactly the same. So what's going on here? Why is there this big discrepancy between self-reported and objectively measured sleep? Well, it turns out that's actually quite common. So even in the US, you'll see the number went from 7.2 to 6.25 or 6.5 when we went from self-reports to objective measures, because it's hard for us to really know how much we tossed and turned and how many times we woke up and so on and so forth. So self-reports do tend to overestimate sleep on average. It's just that the extent of overestimation is far more severe in Chennai. Uh, by the way, people spend plenty of time in bed. So it's not that people don't care about sleep or not trying to sleep. So both in self-reports and what the actigraph measures, people are actually spending 8 hours per night in bed, but they're only able to convert that into about 5.5 hours of sleep. So this implies that the sleep efficiency, and this is a very typical sort of one of the most important measures of sleep quality, which is about 85 to 95% in the US, in India is only 70%. So normal sleep efficiency or good quality sleep efficiency is above 85%. That's what you typically find in the US. That is 85 to 95% of the time that you're in bed trying to sleep, you're actually asleep. Well, in India, that number is only 70%. It's low even at, this is not because people are actually not trying to sleep, they're watching TV. It's 70% even at 3 o'clock in the morning. Okay. This is lower than or comparable or lower than people with sleep apnea, people with insomnia, or with elderly populations in rich countries. So there's other measures you can look at. So for example, how many times do you wake up at night? So if we count it as waking up, if you're moving for at least 5 minutes in a row, then that's 10 times per night in our sample. If you count it as 2 minutes, which is another cutoff sleep scientists often use, then it's 32 minutes per night. Okay. And on average, what's the longest amount of time that you sleep uninterrupted? It's 55 minutes. Whereas one sleep cycle that takes you through the different stages of sleep is typically 70 to 120 minutes. So you are not getting to actually go through your sleep cycles without interruptions. Let me show you sort of actually, let me say one thing. So what does this low sleep efficiency imply? First, it implies the sleep is low quality, and it could be that low quality sleep is just not very helpful to you. But the second is it's very costly in terms of time to increase sleep. If your sleep efficiency is so low, and I tell you, well, you need to sleep half an hour more a night, that's going to take you not 30, but 45 minutes, 40 minutes more in bed. So the time cost of sleeping more is also going to be high. Okay. And finally, just to help you visualize what sleep is like here, this is a very typical night of sleep in our sample from an actigraph. So red bars are when you are classified as being awake by the algorithm, and that's because you are moving a lot. And gray bars are when you are classified as being asleep. Remember, I told you this is considered to be like 90+%, accurate compared to seeing your brain waves and sort of, more even more careful ways of measuring sleep. And so what you're going to see is that this person has some stretches of sleep, but has very frequent interruptions. And this is not some very selected individual. This is literally the typical night of sleep in Chennai. This person on this particular night spent 7 hours and 45 minutes in bed, got 5 hours and 20 minutes of physical sleep, sleep efficiency of 69%, and woke up 31 times. Okay, they never went longer than 45 minutes uninterrupted, which must be this period here. Now, what should sleep typically look like? Well, here is one of the best nights of sleep we see in our sample. This is what sleep should look like. Okay, and this is 90% efficiency. Remember, I told you, in the US, you usually find 85 to 95% efficiency in populations of a similar age. So what we've established is that night sleep is really, really poor and low in quantity in the sample in Chennai. Let me say a little bit about napping. Well, naps are actually, quite common around the world, are not studied, I think, as much by scientists as they should be. And there's some sense, some belief that they're especially common in tropical countries, which might make sense because you might think there's, early in the afternoon when it's extremely hot, it's hard to really be very productive at work. So it makes sense to take a nap because the opportunity cost is lower. Okay. And growing up in India, long afternoon work breaks used to be pretty common, but sort of modern industrialized work schedules are increasingly crowding them out, right? Are precluding the possibility of naps. This is kind of interesting because, you know, depending on our sample was people who kind of didn't have a job before, right, which is why they were willing to work for a month for us. They were about 70% of them were reporting napping on at least one day in the previous week. And in our broader study, it's something like 40% on a given day take a nap in India. So naps are still pretty common in India, but napping at work is becoming, is pretty unusual. Which is kind of interesting because in a bunch of Western workplaces, nap opportunities are increasingly being introduced. So, Google, NASA, Facebook, a bunch of other places. Of course, now that many of us are working from home, I imagine this makes, naps even more common. So, okay, so that's where people were. Naps are fairly popular. Night sleep is shockingly poor. Now, what's our experiment? We have these 450 participants, and for the first 8 days of the study, they are all in what we might consider a baseline period. In this baseline period, we are measuring everyone's sleep, but we're also measuring their work productivity, and we're getting baseline measures of the various outcome variables I'm going to tell you about soon. And then at the end of day 8, folks get randomized to 3 different conditions or 2 different night sleep treatments. So either it's a control group where they continue with their lives as before, or a group where they receive some devices to take home to improve their home sleep environment. I'll tell you about that in a sec. And they receive some verbal encouragement to sleep more. So just every day we tell them, here's how much the watch said you slept, and here's, why don't you try and sleep more? You're not getting kind of the what scientists say you should get. Or in another group where they receive sort of modest daily financial incentives to increase their sleep compared to the baseline period. Okay, so that's going to be the incentives group. But they also get randomized to either get to take a nap in the office every day or to instead not take a nap. So there's going to be a nap group and a no nap group. And the nap is going to be from about 1:30 to 2 in the afternoon every day. You might ask, well, if you're not taking a nap, what are you doing? And here we are going to further randomize people to either, just basically have the option of working through that nap, that nap period that some of their friends are getting, or not friends, colleagues are getting, or we have an enforced break of the same length, right? Like this way, we are able to compare people who get a nap with those who, just work through that period, and that might be a useful comparison, say, for an employer. Right, so an employer could have people take a nap or they just work through it, and the employer could then measure what's the total amount of work that gets done, right? Or we could compare a nap to people who take a break of the same length, because otherwise we wouldn't really know, is it the effect of sleep or is it just the effect of taking a break or getting some rest of that length, right? So we're able to provide both of these comparisons through this research design. And people are going to go through this for about 3 weeks, okay? So just to be clear, it could be that sleeping more has some enormous effects or positive or negative effects over if you did it for years. We're not going to be able to say anything about that. We're going to say the heart treatment period is only 3 weeks. Having said that, as I mentioned, almost all experimental studies on sleep are 1 night, 2 nights, up to a week. And so compared to that, we're actually, giving you some longer run effects. All right, so those were our treatments. Well, what's the effect? The control group, as I told you, slept about 5.6 hours per night to begin with. And once the treatment period begins, there's not much change in that. There's some fluctuations up and down, there's some noise, but essentially the control group keeps sleeping the same as we would expect. The treatment groups instead, immediately start to sleep substantially more. So if you just get verbal encouragement and these devices, sorry, I didn't say what the devices are. So you get a mattress, pillows, eye plugs, no, not eye plugs, earplugs, eye shades, and so on. We think ex post, those were all used a bit, but I don't think they really made a big difference. It's more the verbal and financial encouragement that mattered. I'll tell you more in a second why we think that is. But just verbal encouragement and daily feedback on your sleep got you to sleep about 20 minutes more per night. If we gave you these financial incentives, which are something like, you're earning on average something like 40 to 50 cents per night for sleeping more, that's getting you to about 30 minutes more of sleep per night. And by the way, these are actually quite large effects compared to, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia or compared to sleeping pills. So these are, when you compare them to other ways of getting people to sleep more, these are pretty large effects. And they're sustained over these 3 weeks. Now, the disappointing thing, and the reason why we think giving people the mattresses and eye shades and so on didn't really do too much, is they did not improve sleep efficiency. So the ratio of the sleep you got divided by the time you spent in bed didn't really change. Okay, this means that the entire increase in sleep you had came from spending more time in bed. Okay, that means there's a very high opportunity cost of increased sleep. You're spending 30 to 45 minutes more in bed. You're going to bed earlier and you're staying in bed longer. We don't entirely know what this is crowding out. Partly, I think it's less time spent watching TV, socializing, using cell phones. People also report exercise, which being crowded out, which may be right in the morning, but I'm a little skeptical of. But anyway, so the night sleep treatments get you to sleep much more at night by getting you to spend more time in bed. The nap treatments turn out to be very popular. On 90% of days when you are assigned to take a nap, people self-report and the actigraphs agree that people manage to fall asleep. And on average, they slept about 15, 16 minutes out of this 30-minute period. Okay, so the naps are kind of short. These are power naps. And now let's move on to our, I think, kind of one of our main and quite surprising findings. We essentially have no discernible positive impacts of increased night sleep. So I'm going to get into some of these outcomes in more detail later, but the main thing I want you to remember is when you average across all the different outcomes we measure, the work outcomes, the cognitive function or attention outcomes, outcomes about economic preferences and well-being, sleeping 30 minutes more per night had basically no effect. The one effect it had is a negative effect on labor supply, that is on your work. So if you're spending 40 minutes more a night in bed, you have less minutes available in the day, and some of those come out of your work. You show up at work later, essentially, 8 minutes a day later. And that's the only real significant effect, and it's a negative one. This was totally surprising to us, and not just to us, because we had experts in sleep science and in economics make predictions, sort of do a survey and go on record making predictions about what they thought we would find. This is before we had our results sort of opened up and unblinded. Okay, and experts predicted substantial positive impacts on work, on attention, on well-being from sleeping more. That's totally consistent with, for example, the book by Matthew Walker I gave you an excerpt from before. Experts believe that people who are sleeping so little would benefit a lot from sleeping more. And yet the evidence that we provide seems to totally contradict that. But it turns out that it's not that sleep doesn't matter at all and has no potential of affecting these things. It's not that your work and attention and well-being are completely unrelated to sleep. Because in fact, we find that the nap treatment has positive effects on a bunch of outcomes. It makes you more productive. It increases some measures of attention I'll tell you about. I should say here all positive things are sort of, good things. So bars going upwards mean there's some good outcome. It improves your self-control or reduces your present bias. It increases your financial savings. It improves your psychological well-being. And note, there's sort of this pattern of positive effects on a range of different outcomes. So when we sort of average across these outcomes, it's a very significant positive effect from naps, but no positive effect from night sleep. Okay. Now, let me tell you a bit more about some of these outcomes. I won't go into detail on all of them, but let me tell you a bit about some of them. So, perhaps the main outcome of our study was this work performance, right? Because we were in an experimental or study design where we could really observe very well every keystroke each participant entered at their work, when they showed up and left work, how much they earned, which was based on your earnings were based both on the number of hours you showed up for work and on how much typing you did and how many mistakes you made. Okay, so it's a data entry task. This is what the data entry office looked like. Note that this was a task we chose because we thought it would require attention, focus, motivation to carry out carefully, which which may be different in different jobs, right? So it's one thing to keep in mind is some jobs might be very sensitive to sleep deprivation, other jobs might not. Given the context, the economic and cultural context we were working in, we felt like we had chosen, if anything, a job that would be quite sensitive to your state of tiredness and alertness, because you really need to pay a lot of attention to enter painful amounts of data. Uh, as I said, we can observe keystroke by keystroke data, and participants chose their hours freely on most days. That is, you had a fair amount of flexibility in when you showed up and when you left the office, but also within the office, if you sort of zoned out at work and were staring blankly at the screen for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, you can totally do that, but we'll be able to observe it. People are paid, as I said, by a combination of piece rate, that's how much typing they do, and by how many hours they're actually in the office working. So what we find is a larger productivity effect of naps than of night sleep. So uh, the napping, whether it's compared to taking a break or working through that period, makes you about 2 to 2.5% more productive, right? And that's statistically significant, while the effect of night sleep is not. Now, I should say 2.5%, 2%, this may seem very small. Well, it turns out productivity is really hard to change. Productivity, sort of your speed of working, is generally pretty hard to change in workplaces. So we had in our experiment also variation in how much you got paid for typing. That is, how much you got paid per character of data you entered. And if we quadrupled how much we were paying you per character, like 4x, 4x, that increased productivity by only 10%. So compared to that, a 2.5% increase is sort of not nothing. Now, keep in mind that the nap treatment got you to sleep about 15 minutes more during the afternoon. Actually, you ended up sleeping about 6 minutes less at night. So if you look at total 24-hour sleep, it's about 10 minutes more of sleep per night. Whereas the night sleep treatment got you to sleep 30 minutes more per night. So naps were 1/3 as much sleep, but got a bigger productivity effect. Okay, so naps really had sort of much more bang for the buck in terms of productivity. Interestingly, it's not just in the afternoon after your nap that you are more productive if you've gotten a nap. It's even during the day before that. This may be because napping every day adds up and makes you more productive and less tired in general. Or it could be that knowing that you have a nap coming up in the afternoon allows you to work harder in the morning. However, increasing sleep, whether it's naps or through night sleep, comes with some opportunity costs. So the night sleep treatment works about 10 minutes less per day. Okay. Well, for the nap treatment, it depends. What are you comparing it to? A nap compared to an enforced break of the same length? Of course, there's no effect on your labor supply because in both cases, we're taking 30 minutes out of your day. Whereas compared to taking 30 minutes out of your day, well, it takes 26 minutes out of your workday. Maybe you stay at office 4 minutes longer. So it really depends which comparison you want to make, nap versus break or nap versus work, what you're going to conclude about the labor supply effect. And therefore, the impact on earnings is going to depend on the comparison. Naps make you earn more, it makes you produce more overall, makes you earn more compared to taking a break of the same length. So if you're going to take a 30-minute break, it's better just to nap in that. But if you're an employer and you could just have people work through that break instead, it's not obvious you'd want to do naps, okay? Because overall sort of output and earnings go down. Now, let me tell you in the little bit of time I have left about some of the more behavioral outcomes. And there are many more details in the paper if you're interested. Well, one thing we do is we take a very standard measure of sustained attention that sleep scientists invented, and in fact have used to study things like sleep deprivation or alertness among astronauts in space, and all kinds of other settings, truck drivers, and of course used it in the lab a lot. It's a mind-numbingly boring task in some sense. So what happens is a number appears on the screen and starts counting up, and you need to click a mouse as fast as possible when the number appears. And then there'll be some random wait for the next number to appear, and suddenly it'll appear, start counting up. So how quickly you react and whether you miss some of these or you're too slow, that's your measure of alertness. And this is a task that in the lab has been shown to be quite sensitive to sleep deprivation. And we have people do this task almost every day in the afternoon. Very consistent with what I showed you before on the work outcomes. The night sleep treatment does nothing to this. Sleeping 30 minutes more a night does not make you more alert in the afternoon. Whereas napping in the early afternoon makes you substantially more alert in the afternoon. Okay, so just as before, naps increase this measure of alertness, or what's called simple attention by some cognitive psychologists, whereas increased night sleep does not. I'm going to skip one little thing in the interest of time, and I'm going to tell you about some effects on measures of what economists might call self-control or time preferences, which is essentially how much are you willing to give up some pleasurable thing today in order to benefit in the future, or how much are you willing to do something difficult today in order to benefit in the future. And we measure this in two ways. The first is essentially figuring out, would you like to procrastinate and push your work into the future? So if you have a given amount of work to do, how would you like to divide it between what I'll do today by the way, this is work done at 5 p.m. when the option is otherwise just going home early. How much are you willing to work today versus pushing that work into the future, even though in the future you might have to do even more work to make up for it, okay? And so what we find here is, as others have found before us, people have a preference for working later compared to working now. So this is if I give you a given amount of work, or I offer you, how much work would you like to do at different pay schemes, different piece rates, people will say, well, today I'll only do this amount, but tomorrow I'll do more, right? This may be familiar to many of you. I'll go to the gym tomorrow. I don't want to go today, okay? And so this is what economists or behavioral economists call present bias, and we find evidence of present bias in this population. And interestingly, patience, or the opposite of present bias, it increases because of naps. So the night sleep treatment, again, does not increase your self-control, but the naps increase your self-control. That is, it reduces this wedge between how much work you're willing to do today versus in the future. Okay, it makes you treat the future more like you treat today. And this ends up translating also into effects on financial behavior. So one thing we offer participants is a savings account. It's a temporary 1-month job. It comes with a temporary savings account, which may give you a very attractive interest rate of, we do 0, 1, or 2% interest per day. So it's a great deal to be saving some of your money. And the control group saves about 15% of their daily earnings. They choose to put into the savings account. And at the end of the study, or whenever you want, you can take the money out, okay, at the latest at the end of the study. Okay, so what do we find? Well, we find that the night sleep treatment does not affect how much of your earnings you choose to save, but the nap treatment does. The nap treatment makes you deposit about 14 or 15% more. Anyway, there's a bunch of different outcomes one can look at. So the nap group basically takes advantage of the high interest and ends up leaving the study with more money. Okay, so let me summarize here. We've shown you evidence of severe sleep deprivation among the urban poor in Chennai in India, about 5.5 hours per night. This is despite spending 8 hours in bed per night. So this is evidence of strikingly low sleep efficiency. And this is, there's actually 2 other recent papers in Sri Lanka and in Haiti, which find something, somewhat similar with smaller samples. But this is among the first objective measures of sleep from a developing country. We've shown you that increases in sleep are feasible, and you can do this using, I think, particularly encouragement, feedback, incentives, but naps, if you're a workplace that can offer them. But improvements in sleep efficiency or quality seem to be extremely difficult. At least we were not able to achieve them. And in some sense, participants are not able to do it themselves, right? When we give you financial incentives to get more physical sleep at night, there's two ways you can do it. You can spend more time in bed, or you can increase your sleep efficiency. And what everyone did was spend more time in bed. What no one did was increase sleep efficiency. So it seems like that's a very hard thing, and it might require much bigger changes in your circumstances. So given the levels of sleep and given the sleep efficiency that currently exist in this context in India, we find no average impact of increasing night sleep on a range of outcomes, which I think is a striking contrast to the medical literature, a contrast to expert predictions and our own predictions. We speculate that this could be due to the very low quality of sleep in Chennai, but it could also be true, and I think we need to face this fact and do more research. It could also be true that the findings from sleep labs simply do not generalize to the field. Remember, the sleep lab studies are mostly about severe sleep deprivation for a night or two. In the real world, what are we going to do? We're going to typically improve sleep or worsen sleep a little bit for a longer time. And maybe those effects are just very different. And really, I think we need much more research from the field. Uh, so therefore, there's sort of no evidence in our setting that people are underinvesting in sleep. So the quotes from Matthew Walker saying, the world would be revolutionized if we all slept more. At least in Chennai, that's not true. It might be true in the US. And again, the caveat that it could be that these effects would emerge over the longer run. Uh, and yet, it's not that sleep is useless. Sleep taken at the right time in the right way, so naps here can really matter. They're much more effective. Now, it could be because naps are just different. Afternoon naps are just different and matter differently for your productivity than night sleep. Obviously, it's closer to when you're working. Or it could be because it was higher quality, because the sleep was in the office in a nice, controlled, quiet environment. And future research will have to parse that out. But it's quite interesting that naps are being crowded out in settings like Chennai by Western work schedules, and that really may not be the right thing. But we think this is just the start of work on this topic in economics, or we hope it is. I think we need much more research on the effects of sleep in field settings, including in rich countries, including in developing countries. And we studied a city where things are very different. In rural areas in developing countries, sleep might be quite different. I think using actigraphs, Fitbits, etc., really opens up opportunities for studying sleep in the field. And I think we really need to grab those opportunities. I think we need to understand how to improve sleep quality or sleep efficiency in developing countries. We need to study naps, not just in these workplace environments, but also naps at home and what they do. We need to study things like sleep and learning outcomes in India. A very nice paper by Maulik Chagnani on this in India recently. And we need to understand the difference between the short and long run effects. So we see this as sort of part of a bigger agenda of work on sleep in economics and in allied disciplines. So thanks very much, and now I'm happy to take questions or any discussion.
Thanks so much, Gautam, for the very interesting talk. The Q&A has been very active. There are some questions from the audience about your study method. So let me start off with this one. What would you say about the external validity of the results? So how likely are the results to hold in other urban areas of India or urban areas in other developing economies?
Yeah, so I don't think Chennai is very different than other cities in India. So I would think other urban areas in India, other countries, we never quite know. But I think living conditions. So as you all know, there's been massive urbanization in developing countries. In India, actually less than in many other developing countries. And one of the major challenges that comes with it is the quality of living environments. That is, are people, living in a healthful environment? It's very hard to provide high quality living environment. So that's, I think, an issue across all developing countries, cities, and issues like crowding. So let me say, when we ask people, what is it that makes it hard for you to sleep? What are the barriers to your sleep? people say things like heat and noise and light, but they also say things like pain, physical discomfort, and stress, psychological distress.
Right.
And we think all of those things are actually pretty common in cities in India and in other developing countries.
Mhm.
Some things like stress, of course, are common outside of developing countries, and so on as well. So I think that part, that sleep might be pretty bad, I think might be the case, and we need more evidence on this. In a way, when we've shown these results to sleep scientists, it's sort of, they've been flabbergasted because they have not seen sort of quote unquote normal populations with sleep so bad. And this is just a fact we didn't know about the world until very recently. So I think that part is probably pretty externally valid. What the effects are on outcomes, I think we need a lot more research, and we'd like to find out.
Mhm.
Yeah. So
Thank you. Another quick one is the work that the participants did was the data entry, and so would there be any change with the more actively engaging tasks? So it may not be a drain on resources given a standard task.
yeah, that's a great question. So I alluded to that briefly in the talk. I mean, so here's an economist view. Here's what we thought was going to happen. Okay, so bit of a behind the scenes thinking on the study. We
Mhm.
thought, based on all the sleep science we read and sleep scientists we talked to and consulted with, we thought we'd find these large meaningful effects of sleeping more at night on data entry work. And we thought we would get exactly the opposite question of what Tim has asked, in the sense we thought development economists would say to us, look, you have, data entry is not a very common task for poor people in Chennai. They would be doing more manual labor, right? So you have, in a market equilibrium where people are sorting in and out of jobs based on their comparative advantage and the marginal product of their labor and so on and so forth, you would in fact find that sleep deprived people would not be doing data entry. So, in some sense, we thought we were going to be fighting the opposite concern that, well, did you just manage to pick the one task that is very unusual for poor people, but is very responsive to sleep? So, we really did try to choose something that we thought would require attention, motivation. These are things sleep scientists think are affected by the task.
Right.
As I told you, and I showed you a very common task used in sleep science to measure how alert or sleepy people are,
Mhm.
is just watching a screen, waiting for a stimuli to appear, and reacting as quickly as you can.
Mhm.
That's a task that was literally custom developed to measure how sleepy or conversely how alert you are. And and so
Mhm.
we thought data entry would be pretty sensitive to it. Now, I completely agree there could be other things. Like, so think about creativity. So it
Right.
could be that having creative ideas and problem solving really requires you to be well rested. Yeah, and we'd love to know that. We had to pick something to start with. So if anything, my guess would be, if we look at the kinds of jobs low income populations in India are doing, this would be more sensitive to sleep rather than less sensitive to sleep. But I completely agree that it could be, if you're a knowledge worker who needs to do interesting problem solving, it could be the sleep matters much more for you. I'm not sure it's true, but it could be.
Yeah. Another similar question about your study is that, did you look at what people did during their own personal leisure time? Because might differences between control and treatment groups account for some of your findings?
Uh, so of course the differences between the treatment and control group are random. Like, we have very good baseline balance on things. So it's a randomized experiment. So it wouldn't be that this is some pre-existing difference between the treatment and control groups. If there is a difference, in some sense, it's emerging in response to the interventions, right? And
Mhm.
so in that, we didn't do much. We did a little bit towards the end of the study. I regret that. I wish we had done a very detailed time use diary, which we just didn't think of, because so anyway, so we didn't think of that, so we don't quite know. We have a little bit of evidence that people say what they were doing in bed before they went to sleep earlier. What they would have been doing instead is watching TV, talking on the phone to friends, socializing, and then people said exercise. Maybe that's more in the morning or something. So
Mhm.
those are the things that we think are getting crowded out. But as you saw, the one thing we do measure that is definitely getting crowded out is work. More time in bed means less time to work. And so 30, 40 minutes more in bed, 10 minutes less at work. And the rest is probably coming out of leisure or other home tasks, as you said.
Right. This is something that I also wanted to ask is that does this mean that we should all be napping more, and especially because of this COVID-19 situation, a lot of people are currently working from home. So do you think napping at home will be as effective as napping in the typical work environments?
So there, my answer to you is very different to people following this webinar versus the people we were studying. So I think yes, there is a lot of evidence that naps can help boost cognitive function. So in sleep science, there are experiments where people are in the lab and they have been kept up at night or allowed, had restricted sleep at night, and then you either give them a nap or you don't. And then giving them a nap really sort of boosts their cognitive function. And so in a way, we do think naps, our reading of the literature was that naps might be an effective way of dealing with sleep deprivation. And in our setting, they certainly seem to have been. And I think, yes, I don't think naps are going to work for everyone. There's some evidence in the sleep literature that, naps are more effective for people who have a habit of taking a nap. So maybe you either need to build up a habit. So this is why in our study, it was every day for 3 weeks that you took a nap at a certain time. I didn't get to this, but in fact, we have some hint of an evidence that the effects of the naps increase over time. That is, if you look at the last week, if you're on week 3 of napping, regular napping every day, the productivity gains are bigger than if you're on week 1.
Oh,
So building a habit of regular napping at a particular time, and
right.
for what it's worth, I think 1:30 to 2 p.m., something like 1 to 3 p.m. for about half an hour is sleep science says is a pretty good length and time to take a nap. If your naps are too long, they're going to interfere with your sleep at night. And if your naps are too late, outside of after 3 p.m., they're going to again interfere with sleep at night. So 1 to 3 p.m., you have a dip in the circadian rhythm, and that is a good time to take a nap. I'm not a napper myself. I hate naps. But some of my co-authors are, big believers in naps, and clearly it worked in our setting. So I don't think it would be a bad idea for you guys to take short naps at home or at work.
Yes. um, Another question: are you aware of any economic models that incorporate sleep, like for example, as productivity enhancing factor?
Yes, absolutely. So there are papers that have done this. So there's a very interesting economist, Daniel Hammermesh, who has a theory paper and then some empirics from much older paper. It's cited in our paper. I forget if it's from the 80s or the 90s, which has a model where sleep is both an input to productivity and is a leisure item. What that model doesn't have is sleep quantity and quality, which is something we try to incorporate a bit. So there is some work acknowledging this fact. There's not been a lot of empirical work, but very recently, and in our paper, you can find the citations, just in the last 2 or 3 years, economists have started revisiting the productivity and wage effects of sleep, including using natural experiments, that is not necessarily RCTs like we did, but doing things like let's compare people who live on just on one side or the other of a time zone difference in the US. Or let's look at how sunset time changes over the course of the year and see how that affects the amount of sleep and then people's earnings. So people have written papers like those recently.
We have our Q&A tab is exploding. I'll try to ask 2 more questions before we end. Let's see here. Do you think we can design nudges that can actually encourage the employers to better the standard of living of their employees, like sleep or stress?
So is the question nudging employers, or is the question, can employers provide nudges to employees to improve the?
I think it's the latter.
I see. So it depends a little what you mean by nudge. You know, the, things like providing a nap cabin is not a nudge. Like that's an expensive thing to do, and that I think that might make you pretty popular, might increase productivity. But like we showed you, it depends. Like should an employer do nap cabins? Facebook, Google, and so on are doing them. By the way, that relates to one of the questions you guys had, which is maybe in more demanding or creative industries, apps might really be worth it for the employer. But so think about an employer who's doing data entry in Chennai. they get workers who are more productive, but then they have less time to work. So the total output effect is negative, at least over 3 weeks. Maybe it gets better with time. But they also get workers who are psychologically happier. Like people are happier, rates of things like depression are lower. They have more attention. They pay more attention to things. They have less self-control problems. So if as an employer you care about all of those things, then even in our context in Chennai, it might turn out to be a good idea, but just crudely in terms of how much work did people get done compared to, it goes down. Uh, that's nap cabins, that's not nudges. There is a big literature on cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And we kind of incorporated that into our treatments, which is teaching people good sleep hygiene practices. So in the context of sleep, I think that could certainly be something employers could provide, which would not be costly really to employees. I'd like to know what that does. But nap cabins are not a nudge. At least those are expensive.
Another question I have is, I guess it's really the what's next sort of the question. So in your samples, they sleep less, and even when they're asleep, their sleep is highly disrupted with dozens of interruptions. And we know that more time in bed, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to improve their sleep quality or the sleep efficiency, right? So what kind of interventions or directions should we start thinking about when it comes to improving the low sleep quality in the developing country settings?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one answer I think is that you might need much bigger treatments or interventions for that. It seems like individuals themselves can't do it. You can't really improve your own sleep quality because I think the issue with urban, big issue in urban economics, right, is these externalities. If there's construction going on, so one thing we did is we put decibel meters in people's homes,
Mhm.
and it's as if a freight train is going by 15 meters away 10 times a night,
Oh,
because
wow.
these big trucks, they drive through the city to deliver stuff. They're not allowed in the day because of traffic. They come at night. There's construction going on. These cities are booming.
Mhm.
So regulation on things like that, like noise, you might need that, but you may just need this may be another unanticipated benefit of just much better housing. So when the government is building or subsidizing housing,
Mhm.
so we were funded partly by the Tamil Nadu Housing and Urban Development Board. And so this makes them think about how should they build with, say, windows not facing busy streets, so there's less sound coming of traffic. It might be these really big
Mhm.
things rather than, I'm not sure there's any sort of small nudgy like things one can do to improve sleep efficiency. But the honest answer is we tried to do it and we failed. Uh, our guess is it requires something pretty big, and it probably requires regulation and so on, although I'm not sure.
Yeah, I agree. I think I like how this, how your study is kind of opens up the conversation to a lot of like stakeholders to think about what we should what we should do next. Um, I'll have to, it's 1 o'clock now. So again, we'd like to thank Gautam for leading our webinar today. A full recording of this webinar will be available at our webpage by clicking the side tab labeled events and then clicking the sub tab labeled webinar series. Our next webinar will be on November 19th, that's Thursday, and we're gonna hear from our friends at Swiss Research Institute. Thank you all for attending. Thank you so much, Gautam. You can now exit this webinar by closing your Zoom screen. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much.